Which cruiser can work for new riders, impress the veterans, don't cost as much as a sedan, or weigh like a tank? I rode 5 cruisers that checked those boxes and compared them on 10 important parameters to help you pick the perfect one. My name is Faraz. Let's jump right into performance comparisons. The Rebel 500 was a pleasant surprise because of how easy and fun it is to ride, but it can keep up with the fast and curious Florida drivers. For all practical purposes though, 70 miles an hour is the sweet spot for its 471cc parallel twin engine that it shares with its sports, naked, adventure, and scrambler avatars. I especially appreciated the light pull slip assist clutch when I hit slow moving traffic. The gear shifts are not as smooth as more premium Honda bikes, but work pretty decently in my opinion. However, the Royal Enfield Super Meteor 650 and the Shotgun 650 shifted noticeably smoother, which surprised me because traditionally I'm not a big Enfield fan. But the 648cc parallel twin engine with a 270-degree crank is so characterful that it makes the Japanese motorcycles feel vanilla. My crotch rocket background did make me wonder if they were fast enough for the land of the freeways. And they're certainly highway capable, but the sweet spot is between 65 to 70 miles an hour. To pass someone, you could drop a gear and not disappear, but you can overtake traffic without teasing Johnny Law. I found both bikes to be pretty stable and easy to handle on Florida highways, back roads, and around town. For new riders, these bikes are the perfect introduction to the simple cruiser life. Experienced riders, especially the ones returning to motorcycles, will immediately feel nostalgic. In contrast, the Kawasaki Eliminator, which is being labeled 500 in some countries and 450 in others, makes more power than all 3 bikes and delivers it in higher revs. It's nothing like the original 1985 Eliminator, which had a GPZ 900R bombshell of a sport bike engine stuffed into a cruiser frame, but the idea is the same since it shares the engine with the Ninja 500. I know from experience that Kawasaki's are not the smoothest shifting bikes, but this Eliminator is pretty decent. The slip assist clutch works flawlessly and the clutch pulls are noticeably light. Riding it on back roads, it felt like a nimble sport bike with the comfort of a cruiser. But if you want the most pep in this segment, the Kawasaki Vulcan S wins hands down. Kawasaki brewed 4 different coffees with the same ingredients, but the Vulcan S is the one that woke me up. As a sport bike rider, I was in disbelief that Vulcan S is the most exciting adaptation of that engine. Since Kawasaki is cheating using sport bike engines in cruisers, they're obviously way quicker than much bigger cruisers. But the master stroke is that it is as easy to ride with your cruiser buddies on a Sunday morning chill ride as it is to get on the throttle and surprise the sport bikes in the group. It does lack a slip assist clutch, although I did not miss the assist function because the clutch is not exceptionally hard to pull. The slip function, however, would have been nice for new and sport bike riders so they wouldn't grab too many downshifts and low side themselves into the guardrails of America. Okay, it's not that dramatic, but I would recommend that you behave yourself when you're downshifting. Thankfully, all bikes have ABS as they should, and even though they all have a single disc front and back and axially mounted calipers, the brake feel and bite is quite differentiated. The Rebel brakes are pretty average, but I think for beginners, those progressive brakes may be a good thing. Experienced riders just need to adjust their lever input for progressive braking. The Royal Enfields have a bit of a braking quirk. Compared to modern street bikes, the front brakes are a little softer, but the rear brakes are much stronger. So applying both brakes simultaneously is how you get it to stop predictably and make a veteran nostalgic. The Eliminator and Vulcan brakes are a lot more 2024, which tells you that Kawasaki's braking system is just better than Honda and the Enfields that boast of better specs on paper. Talking of specs, the tire and wheel specs are as assorted as a box of donuts. Honda chose fatter tires and smaller wheel size that gives the Rebel its badass look. Functionally, they handle pretty well and give you more meat on the tire to brag about your lean angles. Interestingly, Royal Enfields have approached this differently but got similar results. The Super Meteor has a taller front and thinner rear tire, which give it the agility of a senior gymnast. I'm not a fan of the CEAT tires which I had on my first car ages ago in India, driving in the rain on those tires was the closest I ever felt to God. They're pretty damn durable, but owners from the UK and Australia seem to concur that they still make you squirm in the wet. Jokes apart, they aren't horrible in the dry. The Shotgun wheel and tire specs are closer to smaller segment sport bikes, and it does translate into sportier handling, especially turning side to side. The IRC tires on the Eliminator may not be as mainstream as Michelin's, but during my test rides they work just fine. The Dunlop Sport Max on the Vulcan are also pretty run-of-the-mill, but I like that they chose the size and profile similar to mid-segment street bikes, which gives it agility and sporty feeling. And before I compare these motorcycles on comfort, let me cover how cool they look and sound. It is a matter of personal preference, and I personally love the Shotgun 650 and Vulcan S, which remind me of the muscle cruisers I drooled over as a kid. When it comes to sound, you know what to do. Hit the like button if you want me to continue comparing exhaust notes in my future videos. And even though cruisers are essentially couches on two wheels, these five do have some quirks that may appeal differently to different riders. For example, the Rebel, Shotgun, and Eliminator have mid-mounted foot controls that feel more natural for someone coming from naked, sports, or even tourers. I personally prefer that style, but I can see why people like the Super Meteor and Vulcan S ergos that feel like riding a recliner. Seat heights are marginally differentiated, with Rebel being the lowest and the Shotgun being the tallest. I was able to flatfoot all of them quite easily at 5'8". Relative to others, the Super Meteor is the heaviest on paper, but because the weight is mass centralized, it didn't feel too heavy moving it around. In fact, in the cruiser world, these five bikes would be considered lightweight. The Eliminator has the highest ground clearance for a greater lean angle and going over bumps without clenching your cheeks. Rebel has lower ground clearance, but since the exhaust can is a little higher, it can achieve decent lean angles. Some reviewers say that the Super Meteor and the Shotgun 650 end up scraping parts when leaning into turns. I honestly did not find myself doing that, but I had to be careful going over speed bumps. A few more things that influence comfort are the seat, suspension, vibrations, and wind blast. The Rebel seat is alright for around town, but the suspension and seat combination isn't ideal for touring unless you're an iron butt veteran. For a parallel twin engine, the vibrations aren't that bad in typical Honda fashion. I couldn't say the same thing about Royal Enfields though. Vibrations are perceivable but not as bone-shaking as an older Harley. By the way, Royal Enfield fans, just like Harley fans, call those vibrations character. The seat isn't that bad on Enfields, but suspension is a bit stiff. During my research, I found some Super Meteor owners commenting that the suspension gets softer after a couple thousand miles. The bike does feel pretty stable on highways as well as in turns, but the Showa suspension is pretty budget. Royal Enfield forums, especially in the UK, mention aftermarket shocks that improve the handling to some extent. Eliminator seat was more comfortable than the Rebel and also felt a bit roomier. On the Rebel 500, I had to reach a little more to grab the handlebars, and the clutch cover kept hitting my calf. Shotgun riding position was also reasonable, but the foot peg brackets stick out too much and forced my feet a little wider, like I'm trying too hard to look macho or something. To me, the Vulcan seat, suspension, and riding position felt the most appropriate if you wanted to go longer than 150 miles. Vibrations aren't horrible either, since it is a 180-degree parallel twin. The wind blast was more noticeable on the Shotgun and the Eliminator since I was sitting more upright. Honda Rebel, for some reason, wasn't that bad. The two-wheeled recliners were perceivably better. The Super Meteor I test rode actually had a stock windshield, which did help. A bigger windshield would be a nice upgrade for touring, but except the Vulcan S, for one reason or the other, none of the other 4 bikes would be as comfortable as they should be for anything longer than 150 to 200 miles. In addition to that, the Vulcan S also has an ergo fit function to let you adjust the seat, the foot peg, and the handlebar position based on your body proportions and preference. If you know someone who has questions about the comfort or the fitment of these bikes, please share this video with them. You would also be helping me for all the work that I've put into making this video over multiple weeks. And while you do that, let's compare the trims and the accessories they get. The Honda Rebel comes in a standard trim and a special edition trim. Kawasaki has shamelessly copied that trim configuration. The Honda Rebel 500 SE gets a headlight cowl, stitched seat, and some cosmetic covers on the forks and differentiated wheel colors. But I think Kawasaki has done SE slightly better because in addition to similar cosmetic upgrades, they also have a waterproof USB charger on the SE. The Super Meteor 650 also gets a standard and touring trim, which gets a windshield and a backrest in some regions. The Shotgun only gets 1 trim but 4 colors. Super Meteor, by the way, gets 7 color options. Rest of the bikes get 2 or 3. Vulcan also gets a base and a cafe trim in the US and Australia. The windshield is a little smaller but does look a little more stylish in my opinion. The UK get a proper tourer trim with a touring windscreen, leather bags, and a backrest. The Royal Enfields have ABS as standard, but in the US, Honda and Kawasaki give us the freedom to buy the standard trim without ABS and maintain America's claim to bravado. Both Royal Enfields have onboard navigation, which is powered by Google Maps and has most of its features. Only downside is that the screen is a little too small to be useful once you cross your 40th birthday. The Eliminator does have Bluetooth connectivity with a Kawasaki Riderxp app, but it does not have navigation. That's probably why the one word consistently used to describe the Riderxp app in Kawasaki forums is useless. The USB port on the SE trim, however, is useful, and I was going to criticize it for not looking clean enough until I realized that Enfield has hidden the USB port so well that you'll have to risk your phone or the charging cord or both when you try to use it. But they're not the only ones who forgot something. The Rebel Dash is missing a rev counter, but then it is not a deal breaker to most riders, and in Honda's defense, it does have a gear position indicator, 2 trip meters, and average fuel efficiency in addition to traditional things like speed, clock, and a fuel gauge. The Eliminator also has a full LCD dash with similar information, but it also has a range indicator and a digital rev counter. The Enfield and the Vulcan have hybrid dashboards with analog tacks and LCD for rest of the information. Vulcan is the only one still rocking conventional headlights and turn signals. Rest of the headlights are LEDs. And for some reason, Royal Enfield decided to retain conventional turn signals only on the Shotgun, apparently for aesthetics, which doesn't make sense to me. There are aftermarket LED options out there that look pretty good, which reminds me the more tenured motorcycles in this group still don't have adjustable levers, while the new ones have those as standard. So if you don't like the reach of either lever on the Rebel or the Vulcan, you're gonna have to go buy one. By the way, the standard adjustable levers on the Royal Enfields are not that good, and during the demo ride I noticed that the mirrors kept coming loose on multiple bikes. The mirrors on the Eliminator are also not very well designed and get blocked pretty easily. So you probably need to budget for those things too. The one accessory that does set the Royal Enfields apart is the standard center stand, which most other manufacturers tend to cut corners on. It's quite helpful when you're servicing your bike or cleaning the chain. But now we get to the part where we talk about reliability, and I share why I haven't been a fan of the Royal Enfields. Growing up in India in the 80s, my uncles rode Royal Enfields, and I had a bad impression hearing them talk about something or the other breaking down all the time. But in 2020, one of my Honda loving friends actually bought a Royal Enfield Interceptor 650, which is the same platform as the Super Meteor and the Shotgun. So I texted him to get an ownership review, and he texted back. Sold the bike, too many issues, ABS malfunction, engine oil pressure error, low battery error despite replacing the battery twice. Now granted, it is a different bike and they may have worked to rid the newer Enfields of the initial niggles. And I'm not claiming that all Royal Enfields are as unreliable as they used to be 20 years ago. I'm just saying that these two are brand new bikes that are built to a budget. Do a little more research and go through ownership forums before you bite the bullet. As for the Honda Rebel, I haven't been able to find any significant issues with that bike during my research. I've owned 3 different Hondas over a 16-year span and never ever had a single issue. In the US, it is actually insane how much money a used Honda costs. So reliability and resale value aren't an issue. I also own a Kawasaki and the general perception of reliability isn't too bad either. In all fairness though, I will link all the ownership videos and forums that I went through researching for this video. And if you have owned any of these bikes or their past models, please share your ownership experience in the comments. I'd really appreciate your insights. Talking of insights, here's an insight into the manufacturer recommended service intervals for all 5 bikes. The Royal Enfields need TLC more often, but you get a 3 years standard warranty. All 5 bikes are fairly simple to service yourself, but in some regions, manufacturers don't honor the warranty unless you have it serviced at their authorized service centers. If that applies to you, save the DIY heroics until after the warranty period, or it could cost you dearly. And speaking of cost, all 5 bikes have pretty decent fuel efficiency and would let you cruise on the cheap. Rebel and Eliminator have similar range, but the Super Meteor 650 can go the farthest thanks to the biggest fuel tank. But these figures are based on manufacturer claims and, as they say, vary based on riding style and conditions. All 5 bikes run on octane 87 in the US, which means in the UK, India and Australia, regular petrol would be fine. Which brings me to the prices in the top 4 countries that watch my videos. The Rebel, Super Meteor, Shotgun and Eliminator prices are super competitive in the US and the UK. The Vulcan does command a premium for a more powerful engine and years of proven performance. So which bike is the best? The one that rocks your boat. The Honda Rebel 500 is the most reliable, lightest, fuel efficient and affordable motorcycle among the 5. The price has gone up over the years, but you could buy a used one if you really like it. The Royal Enfield Super Meteor 650 was among the most engaging bikes to ride. It stands out from the crowd as an exotic around here and is built quite tough considering India is still their biggest market. The Shotgun 650 has similar charm, but I preferred it over the Meteor for a sportier look, riding character and riding position that felt more natural to me personally. Low price for a 650 and a 3-year warranty is also a big plus. And I think people who are a bit hands-on and like working on their own bikes would gladly accept the quirks for how the Enfields make you feel when you ride it. The Eliminator is just as reliable as the Rebel, but has a lot more fun and peppy character to keep you engaged for longer. The shifts are pretty slick and it feels quite light and nimble. For someone who likes naked bikes but prefers this muscle cruiser styling, this is a great option. The Vulcan S is the most powerful, peppy, comfortable bike in this comparison with pretty cool power cruiser styling. When I'm ready to escape midlife crisis, the Vulcan S Cafe would be my ticket to freedom. Speaking of midlife crisis, if you're missing a Harley or an Indian, you could watch this video where I compared 7 motorcycles including the fancy ones. You could subscribe to watch more motorcycle comparison videos. This is Faraz enlightening the rider community one video at a time.